Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Early on in his work, the Poetics, Aristotle is going to provide us with a kind of fragmentary discussion of the development of different types of what we can call very broadly poetry or mimetic uses of certain elements that definitely include language, but can also include some other things as well. So we've got this very broad category of mimesis or imitation, which winds up being absolutely central to poetry, to works that are created, which is poesis, right? Coming from the term poiein, to make or to do. So Aristotle is going to mention a number of, let's call them genres or types of these. Beginning early on, he talks about epic and tragic poetry, comedy, which is also going to come up. Unfortunately, we've lost the discussion of comedy, but we do get some significant discussion of tragedy and even epic within this work. And then he talks about dithyramb, another genre of lyric poetry, usually performed by choruses in honor of Dionysos. He also mentions instrumental music, so he talks about some of the instruments they had at the time, the flute, aulos, the lyre, right, the kithara. And he talks about dance also as being imitative and expressing things. And then a little bit later on, in sort of an offhand remark, he'll talk about mimes of certain people and say that they have nothing in common with yet another genre, Socratic dialogues. Remember, too, that Plato was not the only person at that time known for writing Socratic dialogues. There were quite a few people out there, and we've lost almost all of them except for Xenophon. And then yet later on, he's going to talk about something that gets translated as invective, which you might think of as criticisms, right? Or making fun of somebody. And then he contrasts those to hymns and encomia. Encomia are poems of praise, right? And hymns typically are as well. You're praising the God who you're going to appeal to as well. So all of these can be understood as forms of mimesis. And why is that particularly important? So he's going to talk about a number of different ways we can categorize or break mimesis down. We're going to skip over that because we've talked elsewhere about that. But what he's going to tell us is that there are claims that people are making about where at least tragedy and comedy are originating from. So he tells us that the Dorians lay claim to both tragedy and comedy. The Megarians claim comedy on the mainland, contending it arose during their democracy. And in Sicily, the homeland of the poet Epicharmus, a much earlier figure than some of the others. Tragedy is also claimed by some of those in the Peloponnese, and he gives, some linguistic arguments for this. They call villages komai, so comedy could come from going to the villages. And drama could be coming from dran, which is another term for prachain. And Aristotle's not really that concerned about that. He's more interested in, well, how does mimetic poetry in the different sorts that we're looking at, how does this arise out of something more universal than just this place or this place? He thinks that it has to do with human nature. So he talks about two causes, itai in Greek. And a cause is not just an efficient cause for Aristotle, the thing that makes something happen, but it also has to do with other things that explain why something is what it is. And so, we'll see him talking about these genres developing, so we can think about a final cause, we can think about, a formal cause, and the, typical things that Aristotle will bring up as the four causes. So what are the causes of poetry? Well, he tells us that mimesis, or imitation, representation, is really essential to us human beings. He says that from childhood on, we engage in mimesis. We do it. And, the verb here is mimesthai. So we literally imitate other things. And we also enjoy mimesis. Not only our own doing of it, but also seeing other people do it, or perhaps collaborating on it. So why is this the case? He tells us that human beings are the most mimetic of all of the other creatures or animals, ton alon zoon, right? We are mimetikota ton, and so, that is quite important. What does this mean? Well, we naturally imitate each other. We also imitate all sorts of other things. We imitate the other animals. Animals imitate each other too, right? You can see this when you teach the dog how to pet the cat nicely, and the dog is raising its little paw and, trying to do its best to pet the cat without hurting it. Okay, there's that. Apes have been thought of as a particularly mimetic creature, and we know from animal observation there's a lot that goes on. But we seem to be particularly good at it. It seems to be very much a part of our nature. And you could say it's a lot of how we actually develop as the kind of beings that we are through culture. We imitate. And he says that we develop first learning, so proton in Greek, and learning, or it's translated here as understanding, but learning is actually closer to it. Matheses, right? The word that means to study or to learn from or things like that. So we learn through mimesis. And now what does that mean? Well, it's partly through observing other things, but it could also be through our own enacting something. We could learn something that way. And so he says that it's natural that everybody enjoys this. And he gives some examples of this, right? He says that we enjoy contemplating images of things whose actual sight is painful to us, like forms of gross animals, right? And corpses. And he says, well, why is this the case? Well, learning is pleasant not just for, and he uses the term here, not just for philosophers, tois philosophois, right? It's greatly enjoyable, but also to other people as well, in a similar way, homoios. So he says this is why people enjoy looking at images. Through contemplating them, theorein, looking at them, they come to learn, and interestingly, he says, infer. But the Greek term here is actually syllogistai, right? The word that we get syllogize or syllogism from. We put together inferences about stuff. We watch a TV show, we learn something from it, and not only do we learn what's happening in the show, we think about it and we draw conclusions from it, for better or for worse, right? We could watch all sorts of romantic comedies from the 1980s and get all sorts of stupid ideas about how we ought to behave if we want to go on a date with somebody who we're attracted to. You know, sometimes the imitations are not a great idea. But he says that we learn through these, and so, you know, that is actually something that we desire. He's also going to tell us that, you know, mimesis, because it comes naturally to us, so do melody, harmonia, right? So music, we could say, and rhythm, rhythmos, or meter, which is actually a type of rhythm, he's going to say. These come to us as well. So he says, in the earliest times, those with special natural talents for these things progressed and brought poetry into being from improvisations. So originally we're just kind of playing around with stuff, and then at a certain point things catch on in this area or this area. Somebody's like, oh man, that's good. Can you do that again? Let's hear that song again, or say that line again. I like that, right? And eventually it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's not as if somebody starts at the beginning of human culture saying, I would like to compose an epic. No, that comes later on. That is the culmination of a long progress, right? And so he's going to say that we wind up with two different kinds of poetry according to character. Here, you know, we've got this translation according to its creator's characters. The Greek is kata to oikeia ethe. So I'm not really convinced that this means the character necessarily of the creator. There's nothing to rule that out. But, you look at the descriptions and it seems to be more about the selection of the kinds of characters going into the types of poetry. So we get a branching and we get two types. We get the serious, the semnoteroi, right? You could even, if you want to, say reverent. That would be something that would work for this. And that has to do with, as he's going to say, noble actions and the kind of people that do noble actions, noble people. Now, it doesn't mean noble just in the sense of being up there in the class hierarchy. It means doing things that a good person would do, things that stand out. So, tas kalas praxes, so good actions, beautiful actions, noble actions. Kai tas ton toiuton, and the kind of people who would do those sorts of actions, right? And then we have the vulgar eutelesteroi, and they're at the opposite end. They engage in ignoble or base or ugly or shameful actions, and it has to do with those kinds of people. The Greek there is tas ton phalon. So you could think of it as low class or not so good, right? And these are going to correspond ultimately to tragedy and to comedy, but also to the certain kind of elevated epic that Homer is a great example of, and then to invectives or to other things where you're actually going after people. And there's something a little bit sketchy about that. So here's where he talks about people composing invectives and other people composing hymns and encomia. Now, with those, we don't yet have all the elements of epic or comedy or tragedy, but we do have characters. Characters are being called to, called out, signified, however you want to frame it. And then we get Homer. Now, is this historically accurate? Is Homer this absolute juncture point? We don't really know. This is Aristotle's point of view. And he talks about Homer as being somebody who is outstanding, the greatest. And, he says there were a lot of different people, but Homer was the supreme poet of elevated spoudaia, which is not quite the same thing as semnoteroi here, but a lot of similar ground. So spoudaia would be, the spoudos is somebody who we often translate as virtuous or good or on the way to virtue, somebody who is serious about moral life. So elevated topics, Homer is focusing on that in particular. And Aristotle says he was preeminent not just in quality, but in composing dramatic mimesis. So he was also the first to delineate the forms of comedy. Why? He switches things, and forms schemata there, not forms as in like ade, but the types, right? The structures of comedy. And what does he do? Well, he shifts away from invective to something different, to the laughable, right? Psogon, not just about criticism, but laughable. Haha, this is funny. Look at this person who's screwing up, who we might even be able to relate to some degree. And so Aristotle then is going to say, okay, so we've got Homer on the scene, we've got epic now as something quite important, and Homer is not just writing the Iliad and the Odyssey, he's also writing some satires and some comedic things, Margites, for example, right? And so he says that from this point onward, the different natures of people steered them into two different directions. One is that of tragedy, and one is comedy. And why are people doing those? He says, well, these newer forms were actually grander and more esteemed than the earlier. So we've got, a historical progression. And Aristotle is going to talk about the development of tragedy, which we'll look at elsewhere. But I do want to mention something about comedy. So he's going to tell us that tragedy's stages of development and those responsible for them have been remembered, but not the case with comedy. Comedy's early history was forgotten because no serious interest was taken in it. Only at a rather late date did the archon, the ruler of the city, grant a comic chorus, right? So public funding for something that costs a little bit of money. Previously, performers were just volunteers, so it's being elevated as an art. And he says it's from a time when the genre already had some formal features that the first-name poets of comedy are remembered, who introduced masks, prologues, various numbers of actors. All of that has been lost. We just don't know. He does mention a few things. Composition of plots coming from Sicily. Crates, the first to relinquish the iambic manner and create stories and plots with overall structure. Is that really the case? Well, we don't really know. But what we see here is from human nature, we get a progressive development of forms of mimesis, the best of which, according to Aristotle, are going to be comedy and tragedy and then epic. But it takes a while to actually get there, and this is sort of a unfolding, you could say, historically through time of these potentialities right there in human nature and our behavior oriented around imitation or mimesis.